The first document was never meant to be read. It was not classified in the way Hollywood imagines, no red stamps, no blacked-out paragraphs. Instead, it was buried in a storage facility beneath a federal building in St. Louis, mislabeled as a routine geological survey from 1933. For nearly 90 years, it sat untouched, its brittle pages absorbing dust, humidity, and silence, until a flood changed everything. In the spring of 2024, unprecedented rainfall along the Mississippi River forced emergency evacuations of several government archive facilities. Temporary teams were assembled, students, interns, contract historians, tasked with relocating damaged materials before mold and water erased them forever. Among them was Dr. Ethan Cole, a historical anthropologist from the University of Wisconsin, known more for his skepticism than curiosity. Cole did not believe in lost civilizations, at least not in North America. That belief shattered in less than 3 minutes. The document he opened contained a hand-drawn map, clearly not Native American, not European, and not modern. The scale was precise. The compass orientation was accurate. River systems were marked with symbols that did not match any known cartographic tradition. But the most unsettling detail lay in the margins. Dates. Not approximate estimates, not ceremonial cycles, exact numerical dates. And they predated Columbus by more than 8,000 years. At first, Cole assumed it was a hoax, perhaps a Depression-era eccentric with too much time and poor education. But the deeper he read, the more the language betrayed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, hydrology, and metallurgy that should not have existed in pre-Columbian America. The document referenced settlements stretching from modern-day Missouri to the Appalachian foothills, connected by engineered road systems and artificial waterways. It described councils, laws, population censuses, even diplomatic treaties between city-states. And then came the phrase that changed Cole's life. The union of the river cities shall not be remembered by the future world. It read less like history and more like a warning. Cole spent weeks quietly cross-referencing the claims. He matched river bends to satellite imagery. He overlaid the hand-drawn map onto modern GIS systems. The alignment was impossible to dismiss. Mounds long attributed to ceremonial burial suddenly formed geometric networks. So-called natural ridges aligned perfectly with flood control designs. This was not mythology. This was infrastructure. What troubled Cole most was not the existence of such a civilization, but the implication that it had been deliberately erased. As he dug deeper, patterns emerged. Excavations abruptly halted in the 1950s, research grants mysteriously denied, artifacts quietly reclassified as anomalous and shelved. Entire academic careers derailed for asking the wrong questions. And always, always the Mississippi Basin. America had been built atop something older, something advanced, something someone wanted forgotten. Cole was not the first to notice. In the 1870s, surveyor Caleb Morrison had documented stone foundations beneath Illinois farmland, foundations that followed mathematical ratios unknown to indigenous architecture. His notes were confiscated. He was dismissed as mentally unstable. In 1912, a Smithsonian-affiliated expedition uncovered copper tools near Lake Superior with purity levels exceeding 99.9%. The official explanation claimed natural refinement through erosion, a theory no metallurgist has ever accepted. In 1947, radar mapping revealed straight-line anomalies beneath Tennessee soil, structures extending for miles. The data was sealed under national security. Why? The answer, Cole would learn, had less to do with history and more to do with power. The American origin story is foundational to its identity, a young nation built on wilderness, progress emerging from nothing. The existence of a complex, technologically organized civilization long before European arrival complicated that narrative. But worse, it challenged the assumption of linear progress. The union of the river cities, as the documents named it, was not primitive, it was sustainable. Their cities were flood-resistant, their agriculture adapted to climate shifts, their governance avoided centralized tyranny. According to translated inscriptions found later, they had abandoned expansionism centuries before collapse, prioritizing balance over growth. And that made them dangerous, because they proved another model of civilization was possible. Cole's findings attracted quiet attention. Emails stopped going through. His grant was suspended pending review. A senior colleague warned him, off the record, to let the research go. He didn't. In August 2024, Cole received an anonymous package. Inside were microfilm copies of internal government correspondence dated 1958. The memos discussed containment of pre-Columbian urbanization narratives and referenced coordination between academic institutions and federal agencies. One sentence stood out. Public acknowledgement would destabilize cultural cohesion. Cultural cohesion. Not truth, not accuracy, cohesion. Cole realized then that history was not merely forgotten, it was curated. The river cities had not vanished through catastrophe alone. They had been buried twice, once by time and again by policy. But the greatest shock awaited him in the final pages of the 1933 document, a record of departure, not extinction, departure. The text described a gradual, organized withdrawal from major settlements following a prolonged climatic shift. Communities dismantled infrastructure, rerouted rivers back to natural paths, and intentionally obscured roads and buildings. They didn't want to be found. They believed future civilizations would repeat cycles of domination, extraction, and collapse. And when that happened, knowledge of their existence would be misused. So they chose obscurity over legacy, and it worked, for nearly 10,000 years, until now. When Cole attempted to publish his findings independently, the journal rejected the paper without peer review. Within days, the archive he accessed was closed for renovation. The original document vanished, but copies existed, and the internet remembers what institutions try to erase. By December 2024, fragments of the research leaked onto obscure forums. Amateur historians connected dots professionals had been trained not to see. Satellite images went viral. Old excavation photos resurfaced. The question was no longer whether America had a forgotten civilization, it was why it had been hidden, and who still benefited from that silence. Because the union of the river cities was not just history, it was a mirror, and America did not like what it reflected. By the time Ethan Cole realized the scale of what he had uncovered, the story was no longer his to control. The fragments leaked online triggered a strange reaction. Not outrage, not denial, silence. Major media outlets ignored it completely. No fact-checking articles appeared, no experts were invited to debunk the claims. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been activated. Do not amplify this. Yet beneath that silence, something stirred. Independent researchers began revisiting old excavation sites across the Mississippi Valley. Farmers in Iowa reported unearthing stone blocks arranged in patterns far too regular to be natural. In Ohio, LiDAR scans revealed buried geometric formations beneath forest canopies, perfectly symmetrical, stretching for miles. Archaeologists had walked over them for decades without seeing what was hidden in plain sight, because they had never been taught to look for cities. Mainstream American archaeology had long framed pre-Columbian societies as dispersed, ceremonial, and transient. Mound-building cultures, yes, but urban planning, bureaucracy, engineering on a continental scale? That crossed an invisible line. Cole's research suggested something far more complex. The union of the river cities was not a single empire, but a federated system of self-governing urban centers. Each city controlled its surrounding agricultural zones, connected by waterways engineered to regulate floods and droughts simultaneously. These canals were not primitive ditches. They were calculated, sloped, reinforced with stone and compacted clay, techniques not credited to North American societies until millennia later. What stunned hydrologists who quietly reviewed Cole's data was the efficiency. Modern flood control projects in the Mississippi Basin still struggle against seasonal overflow. The river cities had solved it without concrete, steel, or fossil fuels. Their designs worked with the river instead of against it, redirecting pressure, absorbing excess, releasing flow gradually. They understood systems. That understanding extended beyond engineering. Buried tablets, dismissed for decades as decorative artifacts, were reinterpreted using comparative linguistic models. What emerged was not a pictographic language, but a hybrid system, symbolic markers combined with phonetic elements. It allowed for legal precision, record-keeping, and abstract thought. One repeated symbol appeared again and again in governance texts. It translated roughly to the balance between taking and returning. This was not a conquest-driven society. Population estimates derived from settlement density suggested millions lived across the river network at its height, yet there was no evidence
that concentration of power would lead to instability, that forgetting sustainable models was not ignorance, it was danger. America was not the first civilization to dominate a continent, it was simply the loudest. And now, faced with climate crisis, political fragmentation, and ecological strain, the past was no longer buried. It was knocking hard. What changed was not the evidence. The evidence had always been there. What changed was the world's ability to ignore it. By the mid-2020s, America was no longer living inside a stable narrative. Climate disasters were no longer abstract projections, they were nightly news. Floods swallowed towns along the Mississippi with a regularity that defied historical averages. Infrastructure failed faster than it could be repaired. Trust in institutions eroded year by year. And suddenly, a forgotten civilization that had solved these problems once before did not sound like an academic curiosity, it sounded like a threat. Federal agencies did not issue denials. Instead, they shifted strategy. Language began to change. New academic papers cautiously acknowledged greater complexity in pre-Columbian societies. Funding appeared for reassessment studies. Museums quietly adjusted exhibits, adding phrases like possibly urban and more advanced than previously believed. They were conceding ground, but only enough to control the direction of the conversation. What they could not control was the moral weight of the river city's philosophy. As translations improved, one principle emerged repeatedly across tablets, carvings, and oral reconstructions. Civilization was considered temporary by design. The river cities did not believe societies were meant to expand indefinitely. They viewed growth as a phase, not a destiny. When a system reached a point where maintenance exceeded harmony, when extraction surpassed renewal, it was expected to contract voluntarily. This idea horrified modern economists who reviewed the texts. Entire academic fields were built on the assumption that expansion was synonymous with success. The river cities treated unchecked growth as a failure of governance. Their laws reflected this. No city could exceed a population threshold without dividing into a new settlement. Leadership positions had mandatory expiration dates. Resource quotas were enforced not by punishment, but by communal accountability. Overuse carried social consequences rather than criminal ones. Most radical of all, land could not be owned permanently. Stewardship replaced possession. To a modern American audience raised on property rights as sacred, this was not just foreign, it was subversive. And it explained why earlier revelations had been buried so thoroughly. Because if history proved that alternative systems once worked at scale for centuries, then modern structures were no longer inevitable. They were choices, and choices can be questioned. The Illinois Library site became impossible to hide after satellite imagery leaked. Amateur analysts noticed discrepancies in ground temperature readings, hollow spaces beneath dense earth. When state authorities attempted to restrict access, citing environmental hazards, the move backfired. Drones captured footage. Independent journalists arrived. The the site was compromised beyond containment. Under public pressure, a partial excavation was authorized. What emerged stunned even skeptics. The chamber walls bore evidence of mathematical constants embedded in design, ratios aligning with astronomical cycles. The orientation was precise to a degree that rivaled later Old World structures. There was no religious iconography, no gods carved into stone, only systems. Charts of seasonal patterns, migration routes of animals, soil regeneration cycles. Everything pointed to a civilization obsessed not with domination, but with prediction and balance. They studied collapse, they expected it. One tablet depicted a cycle: rise, stabilization, overreach, fracture, withdrawal. The final stage was not destruction, but concealment. The river cities had not collapsed because of enemies or disasters. They had dissolved themselves. That revelation triggered backlash. Editorials appeared warning against romanticizing the past. Think tanks published papers framing the river cities as contextually limited experiments. Commentators accused researchers of projecting modern anxieties backward. Yet none could explain why a supposedly primitive society had left behind flood control systems more effective than modern ones, or why their cities left no evidence of mass violence, or why their disappearance aligned so perfectly with environmental stress indicators. Ethan Cole watched all of this from the margins. His name was rarely mentioned now. The narrative had shifted away from him deliberately. He was painted as an early tattleist, useful, then disposable. Institutions preferred the illusion of self-correction over admitting suppression. Cole understood. History was being domesticated again, but the truth had already changed people. Young researchers entered archaeology not to confirm models, but to challenge them. Indigenous communities demanded reclassification of sites long mislabeled. Environmental planners began studying ancient canal systems with uncomfortable interest. And quietly, in policy circles, a new fear emerged. If Americans began to see their land not as conquered wilderness, but as inherited infrastructure, then ownership itself became questionable. Who truly built this continent's foundations? The river cities forced an answer no one wanted. They also forced a reckoning, because the final tablets in the Illinois chamber did not end with warning, they ended with instruction. Not blueprints, but principles. Adaptation over expansion, distribution over accumulation, withdrawal as strength, not failure. The inscription closed with a line that unsettled everyone who read it. When you rediscover us, it will be because your world is failing. America did not like prophecies, but it liked them even less when they started coming true. Flood levels rose again the following spring. Another once-in-a-century event happened for the third time in 5 years. Engineers revisited old river maps and found that modern levees had been built directly over ancient diversion paths, paths that once worked. The past was no longer abstract, it was operational. And the question was no longer whether the union of the river cities existed. It was whether modern civilization was capable of learning from something it tried so hard to forget, or whether it would repeat the cycle, reach overextension, deny alternatives, and collapse loudly instead of stepping aside quietly. The river cities left America a mirror, and the reflection was unforgiving.